Everyone, I'm your host, Emma LaRusso, CEO of Digivisor. With a deep passion and interest in technology and what it means for future businesses and impact, I'm excited to be exploring how in today's world, one that demands increased levels of resilience, control and flexibility, how the supply chain industry is taking advantage of IoT-enabled solutions to generate huge cost savings and create better customer experiences. I'm excited today to be interviewing Loic Barancourt, CEO and co-founder of Thinxtra, the IoT telco, which he co-founded with fellow panellist Sam Sharief, Chief Operating Officer in 2015. Thinxtra is now delivering some of the largest IoT supply chain deployments in the Southern Hemisphere, connecting hundreds of thousands of assets on the 0G network it owns and operates. Both Loic and Sam are passionate about how technology can solve operational efficiency and sustainability challenges, particularly in supply chains, large and small, and have helped organisations like Loscam transform operations. Today, we're going to explore new applications of IoT solutions in supply chain operations and how to unpack what is really needed to get control over assets and make informed decisions, while addressing the constraints and concerns of your business. This session will be interactive. You are going to be asked and you'll be given the option both to ask questions. You'll see there's a Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen, and we'll also be publishing some poll questions that we'll be sharing results in real time throughout the discussion. Your responses are single choice and anonymous, and it's an aggregated poll result. And we're actually going to start with a poll result before we kick off. So the first question we should see on your screen right now: when it comes to the connected supply chain, what are you most interested in? And if you can answer, we'll publish this pretty well in real time. So I'm going to be shortly kicking off. We might have a look at our answers now. What are people most interested in? Okay, the ROI and business case. So that's one of the things we're going to hopefully arm you with the confidence from today. And then what are those key implementation and challenges? So it's really helpful for you to be putting these answers into the polls and questions, and we'll make sure that we try and get these answered for you today. So let's kick off. So Loic, let's start with you. IoT in the supply chain is such a broad subject, and it means different things to different businesses. How should we think about IoT in the supply chain, and what problems do IoT solutions solve?
Thanks, Emma. Yes, IoT is quite broad, and today what we propose to do is focus on the industrial Internet of Things, and more precisely, the asset tracking in the supply chain. So literally it's about attaching low-cost IoT devices onto assets, so mostly returnable assets that are moving in the supply chain. So IBCs, drums, kegs, roll cages, all these assets, even pallets from time to time when the business case permits, just to know where they are and what they are doing. And this enables basically businesses to have next generation of visibility and control of their supply chain. So it's very much about adding to your digital control tower more insights about your assets, so that you can enable your operations to increase assets utilization by making things turn faster in the supply chain. You can also identify bottlenecks and inefficiencies to reduce the cost to handle these assets in the supply chain, and as well reduce losses and overall enhance reliability through more visibility. So to make it simple, it's about knowing where your assets are and how they are, and that's possible today at scale with the right price points, and that delivers real value and real return on investment.
That sounds good. I mean, asset utilization, having that visibility, being able to reduce waste. There's always a promise of ROI in pretty much every technology. Can you maybe share some examples of how bringing that visibility, putting IoT at work, actually creates this promise of ROI here?
So yeah, there are a lot of reference customers, but I'd say the two largest deployments of IoT at scale did take place in Europe. And so last year, for instance, DHL deployed 250,000 Sigfox-enabled zero-G trackers on all their whole cages in their postal network. And that was very much to enable them to understand where the assets are and better manage the peak demand at Christmas. And by understanding where the assets are and putting in place the right commercial framework with their own customers to give them incentives to get the whole cages back in the supply chain faster, they really increase asset utilization. So that's a really big reference point, if you may, and 350,000 assets connected last year. So that's a big name right there. Another one would be Peugeot, so the car manufacturer in Europe, who also connected hundreds of thousands of their IBCs that they use to move automotive parts. So these IBCs go across 2,000 locations across Europe. And it was all about working with IBM to make them rotate faster. And again, avoid sending trucks that are empty just to move pallets or IBCs from one location to the other, because you actually understand better where they are and realize next generation efficiencies. So these are two large publicly available projects. There are dozens in the process of scaling up as we speak across the world, including very large projects here in Australia that are even bigger than what we just mentioned. So Thinxtra is in the process of deploying hundreds of thousands of trackers, in particular working with asset poolers in the beverage industry. Very worthwhile mentioning as well our partner Loscam, who is first to market with a track and trace solution to help their customers know where their IBCs are. So that's setting a new standard in the market, and that is real IoT at work.
I mean, it's interesting because you're talking about those really practical examples. And I think, Gartner recently said we're past the hype in IoT. And you just shared those number of IoT projects in the supply chain. How does someone start and get it to scale? Like how real is this for our listeners today?
When Gartner says we're past the hype, I think what they really mean is they are real large customers that are demonstrating that yes, it is operationally viable to connect hundreds of thousands of assets in the field, and the price points are here, like they are sufficient to enable them to realize the business case and justify investments. And so that's the key, really, to trigger and pass the hype. So we are at the stage with basically all the fast followers or early majority now is rolling out. And so the two key triggers were increasing the operational viability. And so there's been a lot of increase of quality of solutions available from now tier one manufacturers and solution providers around the world. And I'll let Sam talk more about this. But around the return on investment, it was really important to make sure that the total cost of data extraction, make sure it's a lot lower than the value generated out of the data that you can collect from your assets. And if you get that equation right, then you have a business case that stacks up. And over the last 5 years, what happened is, companies like Thinxtra have invested millions of dollars to roll out the Sigfox zero-G network across so Australia, New Zealand, and actually the zero-G network is in 70 countries. So that means that type of technology enable the cost of data acquisition to be a lot lower, because you have very long battery life enabled by so sensors can connect for a very long time at a very low cost, and that's really what enabled the business case to stack up. So I think that's really the key, and that's why we see that uptake of IoT in the supply chain at scale for returnable assets in particular.
Fantastic. And it sounds like those benefits start immediately. Even more exciting. I want to encourage, please, our listeners to ask questions. I will feed them to both Loic and Sam. We're just going to take another poll because there was a lot of benefits in deploying this solution. So what do we see as the key benefits you're interested in deploying IoT in the supply chain? So if you could complete the poll quickly. Again, this gives us some understanding, and we'll tailor both the questions and answers to what you're interested in. So what would you be looking for as your key benefits? And just while we're waiting, if we can publish that, I might just ask Loic just for those that don't know, what's an IBC? You've referenced that a couple of times.
It's an intermediate bulk container, so it's pretty much what you see in the background, or what you should see in the background here. So that's my chroma cam. It's not the office, but yeah, big 1 cubic meter containers that you can use to move things. So either liquid or for instance, automotive parts in the context of Peugeot.
Fantastic. So we've just got our first poll back, or the second poll results back. But so it's the visibility and control across the supply chain is where most people are looking for the IoT, closely followed by the reducing the operational costs. So it was great to hear those ROI statements from you. I do have a question in here. It's going to lead into one of the next questions I have. So I will be asking, and I know they'll answer. So let's look at the cost barrier, right? Part of ROI is how do you get going? So cost was a major barrier. This problem has now been solved as this market is maturing. And at the same time, we've seen many surveys show that more than 70% of IoT projects in the connected supply chain don't move past that proof of concept. So and Sam, maybe this could be for you, if we're talking about operational viability, what are the biggest pitfalls for IoT projects, and why, and what are the reasons those projects start to stall?
Thank you, Emma. To make a business case work for IoT is a bit like assembling a Lego bucket, right? So before you can build something that will work, you need to kind of know your outcome, or in other words, have a picture of what the end needs to look like and have that in your mind. And what your business, how do you envision your business to look like at the end, when you're done? From what we've seen, the best strategies have been not been successful due to lack of, if you like, sufficient consideration to detail and execution. So underneath all that, there's a shift in thinking, right? Today, most of us are conditioned to say, I want all the data I can get. And what happens is the more the better. And the problem you create as a result of that is you incur the cost of collecting data, or more costs in collecting data. And on top of that, you're creating yourself a data mining issue a bit later. And that drives up the complexity of the solution you're building, because you say, I just want everything because I don't want to think about what I really, really need, But where the other approach should be really is what data do I really need? And so I can give the devices instructions of what they should send me, I need to get the right data about the right things at the right rate at the right time, so in the context of my operations, because no operation is identical, they're all very different. And the idea is that all this data needs to be thought through to say, does it deliver the benefits and improve, my cost of operations, and does it improve better efficiency and enable me to make the right and better decisions? So you need a fit for purpose IoT solution, so connecting your assets in the supply chain to make them work harder and most importantly, smarter for you, So we've developed a methodology that could enable defining that at the beginning of the journey.
I would love you just to unpack that little, the fit for purpose. So what does it actually mean? What is it made up of so that it is right for whatever the solution is?
So a solution typically is made of a device and then a way to collect the information about that device, which is the connectivity. And then you've got a software platform that analyzes and enables visualization, making sense of the data so it delivers the right business insights. It's as simple as that. So 3 components. So there's a lot of choice out there, right? You can build your own, you can buy what's commercially available, you know, but at some level, there's some configuration / customization that needs to happen due to the uniqueness of your operation, right? Everything's different. And it's always good to leverage what's out there, trying to adapt it. And if not, then, you know, it might be worthwhile investing in making your own. And what happens is, I mean, earlier on we talked about trials not scaling. Managing a small number of devices, being hundreds, and having them babysat is very different to actually taking something to scale, because you don't have that level of babysitting, you know, that you would generally apply to scale. And also a key consideration is to try and leverage what's already available. So if a solution has been sold for a business case, then it's great, you know. If there's a network out there, you know, you don't have to go and build your own public network, you know, go build your own private network, sorry, and use some of the existing public networks, be it 0G, 3G, 4G. That takes it doesn't derail your focus on creating other things to have to deal with if it's already out there. So it could lessen your risk and improve your speed to market. So we found overall, like 0G is quite suitable for a lot of the supply chain applications. Not saying it's the only one, you know, for because it's been quite good for battery life and its cost effectiveness, and due to its simplicity and ability to be configured. So the key is to really work backwards from the business needs and identify the right solution. So, I mean, Loscam was mentioned earlier. For years, they've been looking at cellular-based 3G solutions, and for some reason that didn't stack up, you know, and when 0G became available, we were able to devise a solution that made the business case stack up. It's all about the business case at the end of the day, and able to get a return on investment. So yeah, so just going back, ensuring that you get the fit for purpose solution and tech for your business case, operational viability, and key considerations, and maybe that might get into a bit of the detail is, you know, is the solution or the device able to withstand the harsh day-to-day operations, you know? So some of the devices are subjected to very low temperatures, you know, -30 degrees, and if you don't envisage that earlier on, or maybe having to go through a hot wash at, you know, 80 or 100 degrees, then that could affect the scalability of your solution, because it will be something that, yeah, that would just stop things and you have to go back to the drawing board. So yeah, so the analysis, the key really takeaways, the analysis and the mapping of the day in a life needs to be done up front so that you don't have any surprises later on.
So we do have a comment and a question from Adrian, who's listening. He agrees with your comment about the fit for purpose and the challenge that large corporates have, which is that too many say fit for purpose solutions, and that can potentially be more difficult to go to scale when you're trying to manage all those various interfaces. How have you seen that practically work from his, you know, you've started with those questions, here's a solution, how do you get that to scale, and how is that easy for an organisation to evaluate and deploy?
Okay, so there's so many things that could go wrong after you've completed your pilot successfully, right? So as you start scaling up, you know, so generally you wouldn't have covered every aspect of your operations because you would have looked at maybe the majority or a segment of it. And you could be in for many surprises, you know, not the good ones. And we've got to remember, like, you know, you're all of a sudden going into an uncontrolled environment in a sense. So example, right, you might discover on some of your assets journeys that the asset will go on a truck that is old, or there's a number of trucks that are old and they vibrate too much, you know. So, and they could confuse the device to transmit and start sending false information and drain the battery in the process, and not essentially returning or giving you or your platform meaningful data, false events being reported. I mentioned before, you know, it goes into a freezer and the freezer is too cold and the device stops working and it just kills the battery. And before you know it, you were hoping to get a few years out of the battery, and all of a sudden you've only got a few months left, you know. Or sometimes, you know, the device is exposed to a hot wash and the casing of it has been designed not to withstand chemicals, or the screws, you know, rust because they're exposed to different environments. And all these things, you know, are, when you have like hundreds of thousands of these, that's a big problem to deal with, you know, because you got to spend quite a bit of money and stop things and manage chaos in that sense. So there's a way to avoid doing all that by just being a bit thorough up front, you know. So so that's one aspect. It comes back to being clear about what you really want, and document it and work through that, and expand, if you like, at a pace that is right, and make sure that the visibility you get and the data you're getting, and there's a lot of tweaking that happens even when you go from, 1,000 to 10,000 to 50,000. There's a lot of learnings at every stage, and if it's expected and you learn from it and you plan for it, then you're able to scale easily. So we've developed a bit of methodology with all the scars that we've seen and the learnings we've got, and in terms of working out the day in a life of an asset and asking the tough questions. And sometimes it's a bit tedious, but it's quite rewarding, and it saves you time and cost, and it gives you clarity on the investment, on the return on investment you're going to get. If you like, assures the outcomes a bit more.
And just quickly, one of the questions from Alan was around how long, you talked about battery life, that's why I thought this might be timely to ask this question, particularly with the 0G, like how long do devices how long do devices last? And what is that battery life when you're talking about that changeover on that number of assets?
Okay, so that could vary a lot, right? It depends on what data you want, and it's about how the device design has been implemented, like from the ground up. And there's a misconception that, like, okay, so it's true that some of the power attributed in the battery is to transmit the data, but I think a lot of the power is also expended in figuring out whether the device needs to send the data, because detects so many things are happening to me. So should I transmit or should I log? Should I save it for later? Is it important? So there's a bit of these smarts in there. And if it's orchestrated right, you can elongate that. But you can get anywhere between, you can go anywhere between 2 to 7 or 8 years. And in some cases, if it's not, operations are not too complex, you can go up to 10. Sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, we've got another question to this, which is, I guess, some of those logistics. So here the question is from John, again, concerned about battery life. How do you place the battery on devices that are scattered across the country? And especially, timing that battery life run out, if it's months or years and not planned, how is that best managed?
So, okay, so two things you can do, right? One, you can thinking about your use case, you could plan to say, I want my device battery to outlast the life of the asset it's on, right? So that's one way to do it. Or you might say, I want to, let's say the asset life is 10 years and I want it to last 10 years. Or you might decide to say, actually, because of space constraints, I can only go with 5 years, and you plan to do one swap out in the next, over the life of the asset. Now, one thing we definitely recommend we do is always, and most of our applications do that, and the solutions out there do that, they send the battery level. So you're always monitoring that battery level along with all the data that you're getting. And what happens is having the accurate read and the platform being smart and predicting when a swap out is needed or a battery replacement is needed, you can have 6 months or so notice, or even more if you decide to, once that threshold is hit. So that could be planned into the operations.
Again, it sounds so powerful in terms of planning resources for deployment and not having assets not operational. We're going to go to another poll. So I really appreciate the questions coming in, and we are integrating it into the ask. So this question is, in your opinion, what are the main challenges that may prevent you from implementing an IoT tracing solution? And if you have anything, if you think there's other things, let us know also in the chat function. But what would prevent you when you're building this case or you're thinking through those challenges? We might publish, so cost and resources. So we might come back to the operational viability then in this next stage. So thank you again to everyone. So let's talk then about operational viability and getting that right cost balance, right? How can it be achieved with the right methodology? And if we could maybe turn this into some real world insights into terms of ROI, how it's achieved, what are the types of business cases that need to be constructed, or how do they create that business case to get that over the line if it's a challenge?
Yes, thanks, Emma, and I saw that comment on cost and resources, right? Like there's no point starting an IoT project if your cost will be higher than the value generated. That's really, really clear, and we might have as well addressed this at the beginning of the conversation so that nobody wastes time. But the good news is there are pretty much 4 areas to generate value, and that's with IoT in the supply chain. And that's the first thing we look at when we construct a business case. So pretty much the reduction in the number of assets that you need to service to deliver the same outcome, to move the same amount of goods in the supply chain. Well, if you track your IBCs, you track your pallets, you don't need as much buffer in your supply chain to cater for inefficiencies, because you know where they are. So asset utilization increase. So you can have up to 20-30% reduction. We've seen that in terms of number of packages, IBCs in your supply chain. So that's asset increase, asset utilization increase, which leads to value. Second value would be second pool of value would be very much looking at the reduction of losses. Some businesses do lose a lot of assets, or they lose sight of them, and it becomes really hard to find them. Either they're stolen or just misplaced. And there are some really good learnings. It's easy to reduce that by 5 for some businesses that have high asset loss ratios. In addition, I would say there's a third one, which is harder to quantify, but maybe the most important one, and that is the increase, like the enhancement of the customer experience. And basically, you remove friction. With more visibility, you remove friction from the supply chain, because everybody has access to more information. And so what that means is possibly, for instance, if you had a process that was relying on people scanning, with RFID guns and scanning goods that come in and goods that come out, well, with IoT-enabled assets, well, that can be done automatically. And so suddenly you start to save on the labor, you reduce the amount of billing errors, and you simplify administration procedures. Stock take can be done remotely every morning, and you don't need to get people with a clipboard just to go around and count your assets. You have that visibility. And this is very valuable, because that is a way to differentiate. If you're a logistics service provider, very likely you can delight your customers with this next generation of insights that you can provide them. So back to your question, Emma, which was how to build the business case. Well, we look at before IoT, what's the state of play in your supply chain, and after IoT, how much, how can you quantify the benefits of asset utilization increase, reduction of loss, and maybe more new services you can sell or increase market share with with IoT as part of the customer experience. So that's you quantify the value, and then you quantify the cost, because extracting data from your assets do have a cost. It requires someone to invest in these trackers and then collecting the data. And then back to my point earlier, you need to compare that cost of data acquisition with the value of that data. And that's where it becomes interesting, because you can do a couple of iterations. You can ask yourself, well, if I had a bit more information, for instance, some information about temperature, about shock, or about more granular data, I need to know every 10 minutes where my assets are. Then you see, okay, how much more value would I get? And then that's interesting to know. You need to go through that exercise, but likewise, you need to ask yourself, what if actually I don't need to know every 10 minutes where my assets are? I just need to know once a day at 7 a.m. where are my assets? That's all I care about. And then, okay, maybe you reduce the value, but you still keep 80% of it, possibly, depending on the business case. But you have possibly extended your battery life to 10 years or more, and your business and your cost of data acquisition becomes a fraction of what it would have been otherwise. So you go through that exploration, the what if scenarios, and then you find what's optimal for you. And that's it. You've got a business case with at least 1 or 2 ways forward.
And I should say, because I had the benefit when I was being briefed and talking to Loic and Sam, you've actually developed a really good methodology to help organisations get that ROI case, and we'll be talking a little bit about that later in this session. But there's a really good question here. I really like it. It's come from one of our listeners. What do you think should come first, the ROI strategy objectives or the technology options? Do you force the tech to fit the strategy, or do you fit the available tech option? Like, how do you go about that when you're thinking about the way to approach that?
If you don't have the clear answer of how much money will be saved or realized, how much value will be captured, and how much is it going to cost, then there's no point. Like, at least an intuition. You need to start with that ROI, and then and then just influence the technology decisions after that. And then maybe maybe you adjust a little bit, and usually what we see is you start with a given ROI, a given assumption, and then it evolves a bit over time with either more or less data requirements, but start with the ROI. That'd be my recommendation.
Fantastic. And Rakesh has also mentioned one of the key values that he's seen or believes is possible is the reducing shrinkage and leakage. And his view is ROI first as well. But I don't know if you want to talk to that. Another comment was privacy. Is this also managed within the system? Is that something you could talk to?
Yes. So leakage. What we've there are many examples of customers that track either IBCs or kegs, for instance, and they. It's very interesting to know where a keg go, and making sure it is used by the people that are meant to use it, right? And likewise for IBCs, you don't want to see the IBC you pay for being used by someone else, maybe by mistake, or so a phone call and you can fix this in one day, whereas otherwise it could have led to some litigation, a bit of finger pointing between parties saying, well, it's not, I don't have the IBC, well, you still have them. And so there's a bit of confusion that can be avoided with that. And I think that's really important.
An example maybe I can chime in with that is we've had a customer who started there was a lot. You start a trial with a few assumptions, and shrinkage/leakage is known as a problem. It's hard to quantify sometimes, but they started their trial with a number of trolleys and said, the criteria to succeed is not to lose any at the end, right? And what's really funny is just simply putting trackers on these things go, and 2 months later, I think there was and on the review date there was a trolley missing, and everyone's looking is like, well, everything looked good yesterday, and then it popped up somewhere else, right? So when they went to actually find that last trolley, right, they found another 50 just lying on the side as well. They were not connected. Found out there was somebody in the chain who was actually using it every day, and systematically on their run they would just take one and drop it off somewhere else. And there was a big pile of trolleys. So I ended up finding a lot more. They started with a number and ended up finding a lot more at the end. And it's because it gives you insights, and sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you start looking.
Again, another great example. I don't know what a trolley costs, but if you find 15 or 20 or whatever it was on the side of the road, it starts to also add to the argument. Actually, I really thought this was quite frightening. Loic, you mentioned to me some of your customers' asset loss ratios can be as high as 30%. And everyone on this webinar would have their own figures for their own businesses. That helps the business case. But I think there's the positive side of IoT too. How does this improve the customer experience, and how does it make IoT a competitive? How does IoT make it a competitive advantage for these organizations?
15-30% is definitely on the high end, and with all the stress caused by COVID on the supply chain, that we went from 15 to 30, and that is indeed like a big pool of efficiency that can be just harvested very, very quickly. But not everyone has, 15% asset loss per annum. If you do, then there are very easy ways to know where your assets are and just do something about it. So that's very simple. However, if you have only, like the average that we've seen is like 7% asset loss per annum, and that's just asset loss plus the fact, or simply the assets just go broken that needs to be fixed, but basically 7%. This can be optimized down to 5, 4. We've seen businesses with less than 2% asset loss per annum through very advanced, RFID-based like solutions, and that's good, but still that doesn't mean that the business case for IoT will not stack up, because the asset utilization increase is the big pool of value that we can harness. And so asset utilization, reducing the cost of handling, if you need to make sure that your production line, if you're a car manufacturer, doesn't stop, you always need to have the right components. You need to make sure supply chain is moving. And if it stops because someone didn't have enough IBCs to move parts, that's the value. And so risk management is actually making sure everybody always has enough, and your buffer is, you don't have to have too big a buffer to manage that risk. So in summary, I'd say IoT, there's more to asset loss reduction when it comes to the business case, and in terms of customer experience enhancement, I'll take maybe the example of Loscam and their partner ASCAP, where you can see that deploying and providing these assets, these insights to their end customer actually was a fantastic way to build trust and enhance the customer experience. So it becomes real partnership, or it was already a real partnership, but that's enhanced, if you may, with more data.
Actually, on that asset utilization, again, this is a question that's come from a listener, and maybe, Sam, you could talk to this. We've got this visibility. Do you also need preventive maintenance, or how do you ensure the devices are always in the right conditions as they're spreading across and moving continuously in the supply chain? Oops, Sam, sorry, just unmute.
Yeah, sure, sorry. So I think this goes back to being fit for purpose, right? If it's, so you got to consider the supply chain you're in. So if your assets are naturally going to come back to you at a central point, through its life, and it's always going to come back through that point, then the cost of, for example, reaching out to the asset or deploying someone remotely to fix the asset or fix the device attached to the asset becomes high. So then, that would affect the way, the robustness of the device, and obviously that would attribute to the cost of making the device. Separate to that, you got to think, if it's not a big problem, if it's so easy for me to replace my device and I design it in a way, because we got to remember the cost is not just the cost of the device. Sometimes the cost of installation, labor costs are quite high in a lot of places, including Australia, New Zealand. So, and the logistics around it also to get someone there and to stop the asset, to take it out of circulation. So you got to consider that. So then that becomes the reliability requirement that you would specify upfront needs to be a bit higher. I'm not saying it's going to attract a lot of additional costs. It just needs to be something you think about. The other way to do it is that you can always consider, if you bring your device costs down a lot, you'll be able to issue spares or rotables and distribute them at different locations. So it makes it a bit easier to swap out, and that process becomes easy. So that will be my view on that.
Fantastic. Actually, I think this also talks a little bit to, because we want to make it easy for people to understand how to build that case, get it going, and maybe get those efficiencies so that they can start to be proactive in their maintenance. So a question has come through. The upfront cost is an issue to adopt at IoT in their organisations. We talked about fit for purpose earlier, but are there managed service options based on OPEX models? Like, what are different ways to deploy this so that people do get that benefit, so maybe they can get into that much more powerful, mode that you're talking about? Loic, do you want to first answer? Yeah.
Yeah, there are like a lot of options. So some IoT solution providers will only engage with managed service with a device platform connectivity for a couple of dollars a month, and you can connect your asset for 10 years. So that is definitely available. These are solution providers very expert in this field. That would be very happy to provide this. It's also available from asset poolers themselves. So for instance, Loscam would engage with their customers and offer additional visibility as part of as a service. And so there are multiple ways to reduce the upfront costs, definitely.
This again kind of, I guess, plays to that when and how people deploy. So the question again's come from someone listening. Loic mentioned DHL and Peugeot as European customers, very big companies with many assets, and you talked about an Australian one with, I think it was Kegs, and even larger numbers of assets. What's the application of IoT to smaller companies or to logistic operations with fewer assets? Is there a lower limit, or can supply chain IoT solutions create a ROI case based, where's that line? Where does it start?
Usually if you have 20 assets that you look after, you tend to, as a business, you would be able to, almost count them on your hand, where they are. So maybe that's not where, that's where IoT it becomes a nice to have. But the minute you have more than 100 of assets, then it becomes harder to know where all of them are all the time. And that one or two will be misplaced every month, and it takes a couple of phone calls to just figure out what's going on. And so more than 100 assets, that's where it starts to make sense. The size of the assets, so we've seen, $3,000 large, frames to move glass. That's the type of assets. It's really easy to see a return on investment there, just to make sure they're everywhere around the country, but you need to know and manage that properly. So you've got these big assets that cost a couple thousands of dollars, then the ROIs are immediate. When you start to have $1,000 or $500 assets, that's where you need a bit more scale to make it worthwhile. And the more assets you have in the field, the bigger the problem, because the bigger the inefficiencies usually. So that's where there's a certain art to identifying the problems. But yeah, more than 100 assets, that'd be there are benefits that can be captured straight away.
And another question from John this time, and maybe Sam, you can answer this. What do you do when an asset is stolen or being used by a not yet customer? Do you have any examples of this happening? How does conflict resolution, conversions to customers look like? And where does this kind of fit within the IoT visibility?
So how is it dealt with? I think it all depends, right? So I think knowing where it goes is one, and it depends on what country you're in and what rules are. I mean, whether you're allowed to go knock on someone's door and say, hey, give it to me. But I think what happens is what we've seen is where assets get misplaced in the supply chain because a freight forwarder picked it up by mistake and put it somewhere else, and generally if it's sitting within a business, it's an easy phone call to say, listen, I know one of my assets is sitting there by mistake, and somebody just stashed it in the corner because they didn't know where it should be, So trolleys at the airport, or an IBC being sitting at some other business in the supply chain, and everyone trying to chase the paperwork to say, well, I thought it's got signed, or get the paper trail, if you like, checked. When you actually say, I know it's gone there, or it hasn't left because somebody forgot to put on a truck or something. Now, some assets, people might, theft might be taken into someone's home. I think that becomes a bit difficult because, whether police or whatever need to get involved. But most of the industrial assets, you find they just end up incorrectly or by somebody's mistake left behind or sent somewhere else by mistake.
Got another question, which, and again, this might be a bit too pointy, so it's up to you whether now or we can take this offline, but Emmanuel has asked this: how does DHL deal with international shipments knowing ISM regulations and various bans using WW?
WW. So I suppose, yeah, worldwide. So DHL is so Dutch Post and their postal network is mostly European, and it's mostly like basically they're tracking their assets in Germany, but also around Germany, and so that's all basically the same 0G network. And the same frequency, the same device, if you may. But if so that was not a problem for DHL, and but DHL works like everywhere in the world, and there's the devices, IoT devices, can be configured to work pretty much in any given location. We have actually very low cost trackers that will work everywhere in the world and manage these regulation issues. But the long story short is the technology is there today to enable one tracker to be attached to a ULD that will ship anywhere in the world, and in which airport it arrives straight away. So that exists today. So let's just say technology has progressed over the last 5 years, and it's quite exciting.
And one last final question from the audience. I will encourage the audience, of course, to continue to engage with Loic, Sam, Thinxtra, and we're actually going to send a link post this. But just one that integrates the visibility of your solution into other software systems in organizations. Where does this sit in terms of logistics management software?
The data from devices, it's very much a location data, so it's a coordinate, and maybe it's got temperature, maybe it's got a bit of shock, but that is very, very, very simple IoT, right? That we call this type of assets, this type of IoT, the Internet of Simple Things. So very simple data, a couple of APIs, and that will go into any software platform. So you can go straight into visualization layers. So for instance, IBM has some pretty advanced analytic tools that they're using to predict better what's going to happen in the supply chain. So that type of integration was done. You've got some very simple dashboards with visibility every morning of where your assets are in Australia at all key depots, and that is, there are off-the-shelf software platforms that do that. In terms of integration with advanced logistics software, there are many companies that are working on that now. It all comes down to, well, what data do they need to make better decisions? And that's, but usually it's done in a half a day, that connection. So
wow, amazing. So I'm just conscious of time, and I do have one final question, but for everyone who has been asking and engaging, I just want to thank you and actually share an offer that Thinxtra has made available. It's a free ROI assessment for everyone. You should now see that link. It is in the chat function. Please click on that. It is an option for you to be able to ask Thinxtra, who will take you through a 3-step day in the life of your asset methodology. So they've created this methodology that assesses your IoT tracking project so you can actually maximize the value, minimize execution risk, optimize cost, and ensure long-term operational viability. It is a 1-hour interactive session with a Thinxtra expert that is on offer for those that are listening today. They will apply this day in the life of your asset methodology and make recommendations which help start to create this ROI case that we've been talking about. So it doesn't matter whether you're at the beginning of your IoT journey or you're already considering specific projects. This will unlock how you can benefit from a real-world deployment experience in the supply chain industry. So we will also be sending this to you, this recording, and following up with that link, and we encourage you to use it. Now, finally, because I'm a big believer that, the customer starts to become, or they are already empowered, but increasingly empowered. So we've talked about operational efficiency benefits to the supply chain. I'm really keen to hear how and where customers come into this, how they themselves are demanding visibility and more control from their supply chain logistics partners. Could you talk to those advantages that are starting to come to play and the trends you're seeing there?
Now I think the world is out there, and the world is, it is possible to understand more, to add that next level of visibility and control. And so we start to see a demand from customers that say, well, now actually I expect to see this. I expect to understand more. I expect my logistics service providers to give me that data. It is starting. We've seen it in project requirements, and I think that will continue to accelerate in the years to come and become the de facto standard. Of course, that will bring, that's a good thing for the industry, because that will bring scale to this Internet of Simple Things that will just streamline that create efficiencies, operating efficiencies in the supply chain in general. So it's good for the supply chain. It's good for the end customers. It's good for the carbon neutrality at the end of the day, because everything becomes more efficient. And so it's quite exciting. 2020s are like, as Gartner said, we're past the hype. It's about data now. Yeah.
That's amazing. Any final words from you, Sam?
Oh no, it's an exciting journey to be on. We definitely can see that momentum is picked up for sure, and it's not as hard as the experience doesn't have to be as difficult. Going from pilot to scale. There's just a bit of thinking needs to be put in up front, and sometimes it's a bit tedious, but it's definitely worthwhile. And it's quite rewarding to see things go past that and start scaling. And you see the real transformation happen.
No, thank you. Well, Loic and Sam, I want to thank you for your time today. You've certainly made it very accessible. You've talked about the ROI, which was the #1 concern. How do people build this business case? You've created an offering to make it easy for any of our listeners or organizations to be able to start that journey. I like that it can start and it can scale. You're agnostic, but you actually have that deployment available. Love some of those examples that you also gave. So again, please head to Thinxtra.com if you want to continue the conversation. If you have other questions, please request that free assessment and the methodology that the team will take you through. But I really, I'm so excited about the future and the possibility that having everything interconnected and the visibility to allow managers to make better decisions and to deploy assets in a much better way and actually kinder to the environment, which is your point too, Loic. I think there's just so much win here, but feels very accessible. So everyone, this recording will come to you. If you think it's worth forwarding to anyone in your network, please do so. It would be great to see Australia leading with these innovations, and congratulations, I think, Loic and Sam, to Thinxtra and the innovations you've been driving and just the size and scale and number of organisations you're already helping. So